Now on to my final tactics video talking about battles. Well, the late game is characterized by when both players have finished just killing each other essentially. They finish skirmishing with each other, they finish the melee engagement. So both players will have whittled each other's troop numbers down significantly. So both players will have less troops on the field to work with and to use against the enemy. So essentially the late game phase is determined not usually by the skill of a person. It's usually the player with the best troops in the end wins. So the late game essentially relies heavily on how you did in the melee and skirmish phases. Thus, if you lost your archers, or if you lost your cav, or if you lost any infantry in the melee or skirmish phase, you obviously will not see them in the late game phase. Keep in mind though that not all end game phases are very close. You could have an end game phase in which you know you're obviously gonna win because of the force of numbers you have in comparison to your enemy. However, for the purposes of this video, I will discuss what usually happens when two players have a very close game with each other in the late game phase. Mostly, when two players have a very close game with each other, one player usually has the archer superiority, and one player usually has the infantry superiority. Although both players may have various units of cavalry left, they don't play as big of a role. They mainly play a role of either catching down archers or protecting the archers. So why are archers so important in the late game phase? Well, archers are very cost efficient, they are very cheap, and they can also take down more infantry units. Such, for example, 2 or 3 archery units with relatively full ammunition can easily take down 4 or 5 infantry units, which cost a lot more. In addition, archer units have this ability, I'm sure you know of it, the flame arrow ability, which frightens enemies' morale. That's very important in the late game, because in the late game, since you have way less units on the field, your units are more liable to rout much more quickly than you would expect. For example, a chosen axeman unit, which has the excellent morale trait, can easily rout if it's under fire by multiple archers with flame arrows at once in the late game phase. That being said about archers, you could tell that it's usually the player with the archer's superiority that will ultimately win the end game. Though that's not to say that the person with the infantry superiority will always lose. I mean, the person with the infantry superiority, they have either a choice between just sitting back and letting the infantry get shot, or they have a chance to send their troops out and try and run down your archers. Different situations force you to choose one of the two choices. Like, if you know that your infantry can outlast any missile barrage, you should just let them sit and get shot at, because you'll still have enough infantry in the end to beat back any melee attacking archers or any enemy cav. However, if you could tell that your infantry will not be able to survive the enemy missile barrage, your best bet would be to try and send your infantry units out to run down the archers, as you can see the Germanian player doing here against my Numidian archers. Now, keeping in mind that the late game phase troops are very finicky in the morale, it should be said that you should protect your general the best as possible, because if your general dies right here, your troops are very liable to rout very quickly. Anyway, I would also like to discuss the fact that some units, such as the head hurler unit that Britannia has right here, are very vulnerable to early game attacks. So some units are best used in reserve for the late game. It should be said that some experienced players may have one or two unit in reserve, like for the end game, like let's say if they have a very close game with another person and both players have very low troops, the player who has the reserves can just send them out again and possibly overwhelm any remaining troops that the enemy had. Anyway, reserve dedicated units like these head hurlers can easily win you the battle in the end game. That's why you want to keep them in reserve. Now, an example of when you should send any reserve units out is most likely when your opponent has little to no archers left. Since reserve units mostly have very low defense against missiles, you want to send them out at the end game. Now, units like these head hurlers can be essentially substituted as archers, because they're very effective against infantry in the end game. Like archers, the same tactics can be applied to head hurlers, although you should take into account that head hurlers have a very high melee attack, even if they have a very low defense. Thus, just like archers, when head hurlers run out of ammunition for the heads, as a battalion player, you should charge in all your troops at once, and thus you could crack open the so-called noob box that your enemy would make. Unfortunately for any player with the infantry superiority, it's basically impossible to counter a missile and cavalry concentrated attack such as this. So even if the better player is the guy with the infantry superiority, you can't counter it. It's impossible. The only way for the infantry person to win would be if they had a lot of infantry, if they had an overwhelming number of infantry in comparison to the enemy's archers. Thus, they could use their infantry to outlast any missile barrage and any cav strikes in the end. So, the end game phase is hugely dependent on how you do in the skirmish and the melee phase. It also relies on how many archers or how much infantry both players have left. How much cavalry is only useful really for either protecting or chasing down archers. Now, the person with infantry superiority will have two choices: either sit back and try and outlast enemy missile barrage, or to send his infantry troops out and try and chase down enemy archers. However, if you go and try and chase down enemy archers, remember that you will leave yourself vulnerable to various enemy cav strikes that could attack isolated infantry. So although you might be chasing out archers, yes, they're not shooting at you, you leave yourself vulnerable to any cavalry strikes, as your infantry are very separated from each other.